My topic is the jewellery associated with the women's suffrage movement in Britain in the early part of the 20th century. I'd like to start by explaining the context within which this kind of jewellery was produced and worn. In 1918, the Representation of the People Act extended the right to vote to all men over the age of 21 and abolished property qualifications. It also gave about 8.5 million women the right to vote for the first time, and this was, of course, an important milestone. Nevertheless, it still excluded women under 30 and those who did not meet a property qualification themselves, or who were not married to men who did. It was not until 1928 that the Equal Franchise Act finally granted all British women over the age of 21 the same electoral rights as men. In 2018, the centenary of the Representation of the People Act made many people aware of the suffragist organisation called the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU, whose members were commonly known as suffragettes. Less well known to most of us are the many other suffragist groups who also campaigned for the vote, whether peacefully or through breaking the law. Although I'm going to focus on jewellery associated with the WSPU, I will also introduce you to a few pieces created for some of these other suffrage organisations, such as the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies and the Women's Freedom League. I'm also going to use a very broad definition of jewellery to include items such as official medals, honours and mass-produced badges. At the start of the 20th century, no women had the right to vote. This, as they themselves pointed out, placed them in the same position as convicts and the inmates of asylums. Decades of effort had failed to persuade politicians even to engage in serious debate about votes for women, and it was clear that rational argument was never going to be enough. So some campaigners began to employ an increasing variety of tactics, both peaceful and militant, in pursuit of their cause. Jewellery swiftly became a powerful, if surprising, weapon in their armoury. Most of it was created as part of a sustained marketing exercise devised and implemented by the Women's Social and Political Union in the 7 years from 1908 to 1914. The WSPU was founded in October 1903 in the parlour of 62 Nelson Street, Manchester, then the home of Emmeline Pankhurst and her family. It was a reporter in the Daily Mail who, on the 10th of January 1906, first referred to their members as suffragettes. Although the Mail intended the term to be a slight, from then on it was a name the women chose to use themselves, with considerable pride. With its defining motto, "Deeds, not words," this activist organisation employed a militant approach that was markedly different from that of most of the other suffragist groups of the time. And as I shall show, this defiant militancy was directly reflected in the forms and iconography of their jewellery. During 2018, a great deal of attention was given to the suffragettes' famous colour scheme of purple, white and green, and much of their jewellery used this striking colour combination. However, there are a number of common myths and misunderstandings about these colours, so I want to look at their origins in some detail. By 1906, members of the WSPU had already begun to make a national impact through their willingness to act unlawfully in pursuit of their cause. Then, in 1908, they devised their distinctive triple colour scheme, and the immediacy of its effect was phenomenal. Indeed, it became so instantly recognisable that it could be referred to, without any further gloss, simply as the colours. Its original purpose was to make a dramatic visual impact when seen en masse, and it was designed to make its first appearance at a vast procession and rally called Women's Sunday. The suffragettes had a highly effective internal communications network, and they were formidable organisers. Women's Sunday was planned to take place in Hyde Park, London, on the 21st of June 1908, and it was to be attended by suffragettes from all over the country. The colours were intended to draw everyone together to present a united front. The choice of purple, white and green turned out to be a stroke of genius that transformed both the visibility and the cohesion of the Union. It was Mrs. Emmeline Pethick Lawrence, the Union's honorary treasurer and co-editor with her husband of its weekly newspaper Votes for Women, who came up with the specific choice of colours for Women's Sunday. The idea caught on with extraordinary speed. Sylvia Pankhurst wrote, Mrs. Pethick Lawrence conceived the idea that the Union should have its own colours, purple, white and green, which, selected in the middle of May, had achieved a nationwide familiarity before the month was out. In the issue of Votes for Women of the 18th of June 1908, which came out just 3 days before Women's Sunday, Mrs. Pethick Lawrence wrote, We ask you to be guided by the colours in your choice of dress. We have 700 banners in purple, white and green. The effect will be very much lost unless the colours are carried out in the dress of every woman in the ranks. White, cream or tussore, which is a naturally brownish Indian silk, should, if possible, be the dominant colour. Purple and green should be introduced where other colour is necessary. I wish I could impress on every mind as deeply as I feel myself the importance of popularising the colours in every way open to us. If every woman in the Union would do her part, the colours would become the reigning fashion. A vast quantity of coloured accessories had to be found very quickly in order to clothe the thousands of women expected to take part. The colours could be easily applied, as the Union's leadership demonstrated, with their exuberant display of purple, white and green sashes, scarves, ribbons, trimmings and flowers. This silk scarf, first produced for the occasion, sold for 2 shillings and 11pence, and rapidly became a bestseller, with drapers selling out their entire stock before the gathering took place. On the day itself, flower sellers along the route of the march offered buttonholes and posies composed of purple pansies, white lily of the valley and ferns. The role of men in fighting for women's votes has often been underplayed, but they also displayed the colours, worn as ties, badges and hatbands. This is Israel Zangwill, the writer and political activist, who was one of many male supporters who stood alongside the women on Women's Sunday. One of the most eye-catching outfits on the day was that of Flora Drummond, who had been appointed General Officer of the Union's Field Forces. Votes for Women reported that Flora Drummond had been, quote, the recipient of a handsome gift from an enterprising firm who had heard of her new official title. The present takes the form of a fine regalia of white velvet bordered with gold braid, hand-embroidered in purple and green, with the word General and our familiar battle cry. The shoulder is finished off with a military epaulette with a deep border of gold fringe. The cap is also in the new colours of the Union, and the letters NWSPU in gold on the band. It will make Mrs. Drummond a more than usually conspicuous figure on the day. The image on the left shows the earliest public appearance of this famous regalia. The firm who donated it was Toy & Company, the long-established manufacturers of jewellery and regalia. The suffragettes later commissioned them to make a number of products, including the Holloway prison brooches awarded to WSPU members who had served prison sentences. I shall say more about these later. Flora Drummond became popularly known as General Drummond, and subsequently led many more processions in full dress uniform, often mounted on a large horse. In the event, some 30,000 women took part in Women's Sunday, most of them sporting the Union colours, and between 250,000 and 500,000 spectators came to watch this extraordinary sight. The visual combination of purple, white and green was inherently striking, but there was more to it than that. The suffragettes belonged to a society well accustomed to the symbolism of colours, flowers, gemstones and iconography. Before long, it was commonly understood by the entire Union membership that purple stood for dignity, white for purity, and green for hope. In Votes for Women on the 30th of July 1908, Mrs. Pethick Lawrence wrote in her usual impassioned if somewhat florid style, "What do our colours mean? Well, white stands for purity in private and public life. Green is the colour of hope and the emblem of spring. It speaks to us of the new hope that has entered into the world with the women's movement, and of the spring that has wakened in women's hearts. Purple, as everyone knows, is the royal colour. It stands for the royal blood that runs in the veins of every suffragette." There is a persistent myth in circulation claiming that purple, white and green jewellery was used as a secret code to enable suffragettes to recognise each other. This was emphatically not the case. It was far from secret. As Mrs. Pethick Lawrence wrote from her prison cell in 1909, "I am convinced that wearing the colours is one of the best ways of attracting strangers to this movement. Curiosity and interest once stimulated, the rest follows." By December of that year, the London department store Debenham and Freebody was retailing these women's sports coats with, quote, "the combined colours of the Union amongst the leading shades in these fashionable coats." There was absolutely nothing secret about the colours. On the contrary, they were used for overt propaganda purposes. Jewellery in the colours was worn for a serious political purpose, not as some kind of objectified Masonic handshake. The triple colour scheme was soon universally recognised as an unambiguous declaration of adherence to the activist WSPU. Indeed, wearing the colours in public often provoked physical violence against their wearer. Another widespread myth claims that the colours are actually green, white and violet and stand for Give Women the Vote. An anonymous correspondent wrote to Votes for Women on the 21st of January 1909, proposing in a single sentence that the Union colours should be termed green, white and violet, i.e. give women votes. This suggestion seems to have received no response in the paper, official or otherwise. On the contrary, an insistence on the purple, white and green lay at the heart of the women's exhibition that the Union staged at the Prince's skating rink in Knightsbridge in May that same year. This was a 2-week event designed to raise both funds and the Union's profile. Confusing the message by renaming the colours was clearly not being encouraged. As Mrs. Pethick Lawrence's introduction in the programme says, the colours have now become to all those who belong to this movement a new language, of which the words are so simple their meaning can be understood by the most uninstructed and most idle of passers-by in the street. From 1908, the colours were only ever officially promoted as the purple, white and green. Nevertheless, there is some evidence that by 1910 the press was helping to dilute the message. On the 6th of May 1910, Votes for Women carried a quote from a report in the Glasgow Evening Times about a WSPU bazaar in the city's Charing Cross halls. The Scottish paper reported that the event was one of the most attractive functions of the kind held in Glasgow for some time, adding, "The green, white and violet of Give Women Votes fame form an effective colour scheme." It seems the newspaper was picking up on and fuelling a popular extrapolation beyond the Union's original intention. The Union's ability to get its colours recognised everywhere was a highly sophisticated achievement, particularly in an age of black and white photography. It is perhaps ironic that our understanding of jewellery in the colours leans so heavily on monochrome evidence like photographic portraits and newspaper advertisements. These sources show that the range available included cheap mass-produced metal badges, brooches and pins, simple handmade jewellery, pieces made from precious metals and semi-precious stones, and some fine examples of arts and crafts work. Official honours and medals were also produced, together with bespoke pieces made for specific presentations or for special occasions. The most inexpensive items were simple metal badges, usually made of tin. These too were probably made in huge numbers. The one on the right, which was designed by Sylvia Pankhurst, is one of many items that defiantly flaunt prison imagery. This badge was worn by suffragettes who boycotted the 1911 census, a mass act of civil disobedience. This rare example, offered for sale in 2020, retained its maker's paper on the back, showing it was produced by the Merchants Portrait Company of Kentish Town Road, London. Behind the badge is the census paper of Princess Sophia Duleep Singh, who boycotted the census from her grace and favour home in Hampton Court. She wrote on it, "No vote, no census. As women do not count, they refuse to be counted, and I have a conscientious objection to filling up this form." Photographic portrait badges of leading suffragettes such as Mrs. Pankhurst, her daughter Christabel Pankhurst and Mrs. Pethick Lawrence cost a penny and were much in demand. The Museum of London has a different photographic version of Mrs. Pankhurst's portrait, this one mounted in silver and glass and suspended from bows in the colours. A similar example can be seen being worn in this photograph of Mary Lee, who was drum major of the Union's drum and fife band and one of the first window smashers. Mary Lee was presented with a painted portrait pendant of Mrs. Pankhurst that is so far unique. It is illustrated on Woman and Her Sphere, the website of Elizabeth Crawford, the vastly knowledgeable researcher, writer and dealer in all kinds of items relating to women's suffrage. The back of the pendant bears the inscription "Presented to Mrs. Mary Lee, Drum Major, by the NWSPU Drum and Fife Band, in memory of her courageous fight for women's freedom, December 1909. Set around the edge of the metal frame of the pendant are 3 tiny stones, one purple, one white and one green. Elizabeth Crawford has also illustrated and described another very poignant piece of photographic jewellery owned by Mary Lee. This is a brooch depicting Lee's friend Emily Wilding Davison, wearing academic dress. Wilding Davison was the suffragette who was famously killed by the hoofs of the King's horse at the Epsom Derby of 1913. Lee wrote in ink on the back of the brooch the words "Liberty, no surrender, EWD." Crawford suggests Lee herself mounted the photo in her friend's memory. She also points out that the stones are pink and white rather than purple, white and green. Perhaps these colours had particular significance for Lee, or perhaps she was simply reusing an existing mount. Also at the lower end of the price range were simple enamel brooches and badges like these, featuring the colours. They were commissioned from a number of different manufacturers who can sometimes be identified by the maker's imprints or papers surviving on their backs. W. O. Lewis of Birmingham was a regular supplier. They also supplied the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, and the image on the right is of the back of one of their badges. The ever-increasing demand for simple items like these was fueled by energetic marketing through a variety of outlets to help raise money for the cause, and they were regularly promoted in Votes for Women. A more expensive piece was a brass-plated belt buckle that was sold together with a belt ribbon in the colours for 2 shillings and 6pence. The image on the buckle was very familiar to suffragettes. It had been used on a poster issued the previous year, showing a large woman haunting the Houses of Parliament. Imprisonment provided a rich source of imagery. The silver-plated pin on the right deliberately evokes convicts' clothing. Similar silver arrow brooches sold for 1 and 6, and silver-plated versions for 1 shilling, as listed in this advertisement. Large numbers of these must have been made, but surprisingly few have appeared on the market. Perhaps in the absence of the famous colours, they are simply not recognised for what they are. The same advertisement also lists a more expensive item of jewellery called the Boadicea brooch, which was priced at 3 and 6. Boadicea was an important symbolic figure for the suffragettes. Elsie Howie, a suffragette from Malvern, is wearing an example in this portrait photograph. Boadicea brooches like this were often used for presentations. On the 17th of December 1908, it was noted in Votes for Women that 3 suffragettes who had served prison terms were each presented with one at a WSPU at home in Newcastle. Each brooch had their name and date of imprisonment engraved on the back. I wonder where these brooches are now. Another Boadicea brooch was given to a 9-year-old piper from Edinburgh called Bessie Watson, who played the bagpipes at a huge WSPU procession through the city on the 9th of October 1909. Female pipers, especially young girls, were rare at that time. Bessie had been encouraged by her parents to take up the instrument at the age of 7 to strengthen her weak lungs. A few weeks after the procession, she was presented with a Boadicea brooch by Christabel Pankhurst, who was in Edinburgh for a public meeting. 70 years later, Bessie symbolically passed it on to Margaret Thatcher, who had just been elected Britain's first woman Prime Minister. The silver pendant on the right, enamelled in the colours, bears Sylvia Pankhurst's popular Angel of Freedom design, which was used for many Union items from late 1908. This piece was produced by the Birmingham medalist Joseph Frey. Items like these were heavily promoted in adverts for the union's women's press shops, from where they could be purchased either in person or by mail order. They were also sold in the union's other shops. There were 10 of these in London alone, and another 17 in the rest of the country. Anyone sympathetic to the union's campaign could purchase these kinds of jewellery and badges, but there were also official badges like those made to identify the speakers at the so-called monster meetings. This photograph was taken on Women's Sunday in 1908. You might be able to make out a speaker's badge on the chest of the woman in the dark dress towards the top. The badge on the right was worn at a huge rally in Hyde Park in July 1910, where 150 speakers addressed crowds of up to 20,000 people from some 40 platforms. Some jewellery was probably homemade. Suffragettes routinely sewed banners and costumes for processions, pageants and exhibitions, and they almost certainly made jewellery too. A small bead loom like this one could produce panels of beadwork patterns with separate strings or tassels. This long necklace, woven from purple, white and green glass beads, may well have been made at home on such a loom. On the left is Laura Ainsworth, who organised twice-weekly poster parades to promote sales of the suffragette newspaper Votes for Women. She seems to be wearing a beadwork ribbon necklace in this portrait, surely also in the colours. To the right is Edith New, who stood trial with Mary Lee for smashing windows at 10 Downing Street in July 1908. Here she's shown wearing a similar beaded ribbon, worn rather differently, as well as a Votes for Women badge. Some jewellery featuring the colours was made in precious metals and was quite expensive. Mappin & Webb took advertisements in Votes for Women in 1909, illustrating gold brooches and pendants set with emeralds, pearls and amethysts at prices ranging from £2 to £6. Some of these are obviously suffragette pieces, especially the V-shaped brooch, which retailed at the lower end of the price range. Others could, and probably do, pass unrecognised today as anything other than standard forms of fairly modest Edwardian jewellery. Unless such items can be traced to sources like this advert, or have verifiable accompanying documentation, their suffrage connection would be impossible to prove. Stanley Mappin and his wife Constance were committed supporters of the WSPU. Like Princess Sophia Duleep Singh, they refused to complete their census form in 1911. Stanley Mappin wrote across it, "As a protest against the attitude of the government in denying women the rights of citizenship, I refuse to fill in or sign this paper." Mappin & Webb were among many well-known companies and department stores who took advertisements in Votes for Women. This announcement, made in the paper in January 1911, encouraged the readership to patronise these advertisers who were all helping to fight for the cause. One of those listed in the announcement was Lillian Skinner, who decorated their shop windows with purple, white and green ribbons, and even produced a slipper in the colours. Thomas Lilly, one of the company's partners, together with his wife and several of his children, campaigned actively for Votes for Women. 2 daughters, Kate and Louise, both served prison sentences in 1912 for smashing windows at the War Office. For this, they were sentenced to 2 months' imprisonment with hard labour, and both went on hunger strike. They were both awarded sets of medals on their release, including Holloway brooches and hunger strike medals. Holloway brooches and hunger strike medals are among the most poignant items of suffragette jewellery, those brooches, honours and medals reserved for those who had endured prison for the cause. The first arrests of union members took place in 1905, when Christabel Pankhurst, on the left, and Annie Kenney, on the right, disrupted a huge Liberal Party meeting in Manchester. This proved to be a highly effective means of generating publicity, and from then on acts of law-breaking, arrests and prison sentences became increasingly common. The idea of honouring convicted members of the WSPU with items of jewellery was first trailed in Votes for Women in April 1909, with an announcement that a special Holloway brooch had been designed and would be presented to former prisoners at a meeting in the Albert Hall. The brooch was of course named after the women's prison. 2 weeks later, the newspaper carried an illustration of the design itself. Made in silver, shaped like a portcullis with hanging chains, and with a superimposed convict's arrow enamelled in purple, white and green, it was again designed by Sylvia Pankhurst. Many suffragettes were photographed wearing their Holloway brooches with pride, including Mrs. Pankhurst herself. This example was awarded to Edith Downing, the sculptor, who was born in Cardiff in 1857. Votes for Women noted on the 15th of March 1912 that she had been sent for trial for breaking windows. On the 5th of April, she was sentenced to imprisonment, where she went on hunger strike and was forcibly fed. Her Holloway brooch was sold at auction in March 2022, together with her hunger strike medal, a type of object I will discuss shortly. Edith Downing was one of 68 women who embroidered their signatures on this poignant suffragette memento. It is a handkerchief on which the legend "Votes for Women, Holloway Prison, March 1912" was embroidered towards the bottom. Breaking the windows of government and commercial properties became an official Union tactic at the end of 1911, and a mass campaign of window smashing was carried out in March the following year. Nearly all the women who signed this handkerchief have been convicted for taking part in that campaign. Louise Lilly was another whose name appears on it. Window smashing was a form of protest that had often been employed long before 1911. In July 1909, it was proposed that 14 women who had smashed the windows of government offices in Whitehall should receive a special award. An announcement in Votes for Women declared that the stones that broke the windows of the government offices in Whitehall were precious stones. Mrs. Pankhurst was to present the women who had thrown them with gold safety pin brooches with a bit of flint stone set in gold, and contributions were invited to defray the cost. These brooches were to be awarded to the stone throwers at a reception in St James's Hall on the 16th of September. Gladys Roberts, a solicitor's clerk from Bradford, was another of the women who embroidered their names on that 1912 handkerchief. She had served time for smashing windows before. In July 1909, she had been imprisoned for 4 weeks for stone throwing and had gone on hunger strike for 5 days. That experience in no way deterred her. In 1912, she was sentenced to 3 months' imprisonment for breaking windows at the post office in Kings Road, Chelsea. Her stone thrower's brooch was included among her effects sold in a Christie's sale in 1981. The auctioneers described the brooch simply as a gilt metal bar brooch with a symbolic pebble. In the absence of context, would such a piece be recognised today for what it is? And where is this rare object now? Hundreds of women were arrested and imprisoned for window smashing. Many of them used toffee hammers like the one above, which they concealed in bags and clothing. The silver toffee hammer brooch pictured below, inscribed "Votes for Women," belonged to Agnes Kelly, a well-known WSPU speaker who served 4 months for smashing windows in Piccadilly in 1912. The brooch may have been presented to her on her release from Holloway, but I've not yet been able to confirm this. 1909, which had seen public presentations of the first Holloway brooches and the window smasher's brooch, also saw the earliest presentations of 2 other WSPU marks of honour. This time, they did not take the form of brooches, but instead referenced military awards. On the 9th of April 1909, Votes for Women reported on a large reception held by the Streatham branch of the WSPU, given in honour of Mrs. Helen Tyson and her daughter Diana. They had both been imprisoned for taking part in a deputation to the House of Commons, and had been released from Holloway on the 24th of March. During the reception, Mrs. Tyson, her daughter, and her sister Mrs. Madeline Petrie, who had also been imprisoned, were presented with what were described as silver badges, quote, bearing the same letters and numbers worn by them in Holloway. They were also given a flat gold bar to be used for pinning on our colours, and on which was inscribed February 24 to March 24, 1909. End quote. The DX2 on Helen Tyson's medallion on the left refers to the prison wing in which she was held, and the 7 refers to the number of her cell. Honours like these continued to be presented to and worn by imprisoned suffragettes in later years. They may have provided the original inspiration for the suffragettes' highest mark of courage, the Hunger Strike Medal. In July 1909, the Scottish-born sculptor Marion Wallace Dunlop was sent to Holloway for a month for stamping an extract from the Bill of Rights onto a wall of St Stephen's Hall in the House of Commons. These photos of her are contemporary reconstructions of her action. In Holloway, Wallace Dunlop was treated as a regular second division or criminal prisoner. The authorities refused to recognise her as a political prisoner, with the entitlements and comforts this classification would have brought. Acting entirely on her own initiative, she announced she would refuse all food until she was correctly classified, and other women were quick to follow her example. The union's leadership rapidly understood how effectively this dangerous tactic attracted the attention of the press and found a powerful way to reward it. A WSPU at-home meeting took place at St James's Hall, Great Portland Street, on the 29th of July 1909. At this meeting, Mrs Pethick Lawrence announced that those early hunger strikers who had just been released from Holloway would each be presented with a commemorative medal in recognition of what they had suffered for the cause. Mrs Pankhurst then pinned the first hunger strike medal to the chest of Mary Allen, whom she addressed as a woman soldier in the Women's Army. Mary Allen said she was grateful to Miss Wallace Dunlop for having shown the way. Another hunger striker, Gertrude Holtwhite Simmons, declared she had never cared much for badges, but would value this medal as the dearest thing she had. This hunger strike medal from 1909 was presented to Teresa Garnett, one of those first hunger strikers. From that year on, the medals were presented with the same formality and import as military honours, and were worn at public events with great pride. As with military medals, silver bars were added to record each period of hunger striking. This example represents 3 separate imprisonments, all in the summer of 1909. This is Kate Williams Evans, a Welsh suffragette, pictured alongside her hunger strike medal, complete with its original presentation box. It is now in the National Museum, Wales. She was arrested on the 4th of March 1912 and tried at Bow Street, alongside some 50 similar cases, for smashing windows at government offices. For this, she was sentenced to 2 months' hard labour. She went on hunger strike in April. Within 2 months of the first hunger strikes in 1909, the authorities had introduced the barbaric practice of force feeding, usually administered by tubes up the nose and down the back of the throat. Bars enamelled in the WSPU colours were therefore added to the ribbons to record episodes of this force feeding. This is the hunger strike medal with force feeding bar, awarded to the sculptor Edith Downing, whose Holloway brooch we saw earlier. She was sent to Holloway for 6 months in 1912 for smashing the windows of an art dealer and a tea room in central London. Her medal was sold at auction in March 2022 for £22,750. While prices like these reflect the popular interest in items of this kind, their true value, as with so much suffrage material, lies in the human stories behind them and the light they shed on our understanding of the past. Evolving tales of quite extraordinary feats of bravery and fortitude lie behind each medal, and here are just 2 examples. This is Lady Constance Lytton, wearing a Holloway brooch, prison medal and hunger strike medal with bars. She had been a chronic invalid from childhood. This prison medal to the left was awarded for her month-long imprisonment in February 1909. The DX3 again records the prison wing in which she was held, the 10 below the number of her cell. Lady Constance was kept in a hospital ward for most of her sentence due to both her poor health and her aristocratic background. She received the hunger strike medal to the right for a second month-long prison sentence in 1909. However, she was swiftly released due to her known heart condition. Determined to experience hunger striking and force feeding in the same way that a working-class woman without privilege would have done, she took part in a demonstration outside Walton Gaol in Liverpool in January 1910 in the guise of a seamstress called Jane Wharton. She was arrested again, and this time, unrecognised as Lady Constance, was sentenced to 14 days hard labour. She went on hunger strike and was forcibly fed some 7 times. This treatment led to a series of strokes in 1912, from which she never recovered. This hunger strike medal, shown front and back, was awarded to the New Zealand-born Frances Parker, known as Fanny, who was the niece of Field Marshal Lord Kitchener. It is now in the Museum of New Zealand Te Papa Tongarewa. The 2 silver bars record 2 hunger strikes in 1912 and 1913, and the enamelled bars 2 episodes of force feeding, but she also endured other hunger strikes and force feeding. The most brutal of these occurred in Scotland in 1914, after she was arrested for attempting to blow up Robert Burns's cottage in Alloway. On this occasion, she used the alias Janet Arthur. When she went on hunger strike in Ayr Prison, she was sent to Perth Prison to be fed by force, which was carried out several times via her rectum. This is the statement she gave Votes for Women about the inhuman treatment meted out to her. Her shocking claim in the last column that a wardress had inflicted on her a grosser and more indecent outrage which could have been done for no other purpose than torture was subsequently verified by an independent medical report. The wearing of honours like hunger strike medals, prison medals and Holloway brooches was designed to gain maximum public attention. By the time of the From Prison to Citizenship procession of June 1910, there had already been 617 imprisonments to win freedom for women, as the large banner in the centre of the image proudly proclaimed. Many of the convicted women marched behind Mary Lee's drum and fife band, all dressed in white and wearing their badges and medals pinned at the left breast. The effect of this procession of predominantly middle and upper class women convicts must have been sensational. One of the most intriguing areas of suffragette jewellery concerns pieces that were specially commissioned for individual women. Most are only known to survive in descriptions or illustrations. This painting of Flora Drummond, seen earlier wearing her dress uniform, is now in the Scottish National Portrait Gallery. It was commissioned by former suffragettes in 1936 from the artist Flora Lyon to be hung in the Forum Club, one of the first clubs for women. When the portrait was made, this formidable campaigner was in her late 50s. Drummond had intended to become a postmistress, at that time the highest position available to women in the civil service. However, despite passing all the qualifying exams, she was rejected because of her height. New regulations meant she was an inch shorter than the required minimum of 5'2". She retrained as a typist and moved to Manchester, where she became an administrator and speaker for the WSPU. In 1906 she went to London to continue her union work and had served her first prison sentence by the end of the year. Drummond rapidly became one of the few working-class leaders of the movement. Her campaigns of disruption led to 9 terms of imprisonment and 5 hunger strikes. Drummond was interviewed about the painting for an article published in the Aberdeen Press and Journal in April 1936. In the portrait, she is shown wearing a hunger strike medal pinned prominently to her chest. She told her interviewer, "Do you see that medal on me in the portrait? Well, I got that for being so often in prison." "How often?" "Well, I've really forgotten how often. That was when I was hunger striking. I've held out for 10 days and often did 7 or 8 or 9 days. Interestingly, the medal is not shown with any bars. Drummond is also wearing a striking arts and crafts style necklace, which is deliberately placed at the focal point of the painting, right next to the hunger strike medal. Unfortunately, she didn't mention the necklace in the interview, although it clearly had particular importance for her. Both medal and pendant are shown impressionistically, but the necklace appears to have been made of silver, set with large cabochon stones. The central stone is green. The 8 outer stones are probably alternating amethysts and moonstones, the latter being whiter than they appear in this image. There are also purple and green stones on the chain, and apparently pearls. The necklace was evidently made by a jeweller working in the British arts and crafts tradition, and my guess would be someone like Sybil Dunlop or Dorrie Nossiter. For comparison, to the right is a brooch dated to about 1930, attributed to Sybil Dunlop, which intriguingly also uses purple, white and green cabochon stones. The appearance of this necklace at the centre of a portrait of an important suffragette, commissioned by suffragettes, suggests it can reasonably be identified as a suffragette jewel, and its prominence suggests it could have been an official presentation. I am hoping some documentation will appear one day to confirm this. It was certainly worn at an important suffragette event later in 1936, the annual dinner of the Suffragette Fellowship. The fellowship was founded in 1926 by another leading suffragette, Edith Howe Martin, to celebrate and commemorate the pioneers of the women's suffrage movement. Its annual dinner always took place on the 13th of October. This marked the date on which the militant campaign first began, with the arrest of Christabel Pankhurst and Annie Kenney at a public meeting in Manchester in 1905. The 1936 dinner was an extraordinary event, as the guest of honour was former Police Inspector James Jarvis. In these two copies of an informal photograph of Jarvis seated at a table between Edith Howe Martin and Flora Drummond, Drummond's necklace is clearly visible. On the 13th of October 1908, Jarvis had arrested Drummond, together with Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst, on a charge of conduct likely to cause a breach of the peace. The arrest was made in connection with an action known as the rushing of the House of Commons. On the 14th of October 1936, the Daily Mirror published this photograph of Mrs. Pethick Lawrence and Flora Drummond toasting him, under the headline, "Our Friend the Enemy." On the same day, the Leeds Mercury reported that Jarvis was very touched by the gesture of reconciliation, and that Drummond had remarked that he had had a very pleasant way of arresting them. Unfortunately, the whereabouts of Flora Drummond's splendid necklace are unknown. This photograph from 1912 shows Drummond with her son Keir Hardy Drummond. In 1991, I spoke to Betty Drummond, Keir Drummond's second wife. She had just donated her mother-in-law's Hunger Strike medal to the Arran Heritage Museum in Brodick. Betty told me she had never seen the necklace. She suggested it might have gone abroad with Keir Hardy's first wife, Violet Mary Francis, who he had married in Hendon in 1939. This seems unlikely, as Violet had died of a brain tumour in Killearn, Stirling, in 1958. I hope this distinctive necklace will reappear one day. There is another good example of an important suffragette necklace that has gone missing, a piece specially commissioned for Emmeline Pankhurst to mark her release from Holloway Prison in July 1909. On the 7th of January, Pearson's Weekly reported that the WSPU had opened a subscription list to present Mrs. Pankhurst with a necklace of amethysts, diamonds and green agates. In the language of gems, the paper wrote, perhaps tongue-in-cheek, amethysts stand for peace of mind and sobriety, diamonds for repentance and innocence, agates for long life and health. It is tempting to cast the paper's sincere hopes that Mrs. Pankhurst might enjoy all these blessings as somewhat mischievous. In fact, the necklace she was presented with only a week later was indeed set with amethysts, but neither diamonds nor agates. Indeed, diamonds would have been very unusual in WSPU jewellery, where the white part of the triple colour scheme was usually represented by moonstones, pearls or enamel. The 21st of January issue of Votes for Women describes how the presentation was made at a meeting at the Queen's Hall, London on the 14th of January. The necklace consisted of a chain of amethysts, pearls and emeralds, which she was asked to wear, quote, as a symbol of the dignity, purity and hope which she has wrought into our lives. Sylvia Pankhurst recorded that, quote, there was a trooping of the purple, white and green. Mrs. Pankhurst received a necklace in the colours and an address on vellum, bound and executed at the Dove's Bindery of Cobden Sanderson. Tantalisingly, no mention was made of the necklace's maker. This image shows the exact moment of the presentation, and even allows a glimpse of the necklace's impressive shield-shaped box, but we don't know what the necklace itself looked like, or do we? In this double portrait with her daughter Christabel, Mrs. Pankhurst is wearing a short necklace in classic arts and crafts style, with 5 elaborate pendant drops, the central one being the largest. It is shown more completely in this single portrait of Mrs. Pankhurst. In this image, the central pendant clearly has an elongated secondary drop, perhaps with a pearl at its end. We can only guess at the stones in this necklace, although there do seem to be pearls. As in the Flora Drummond portrait, the jewellery seems to have been given particular prominence in both photographs. Was this the Queen's Hall presentation piece? It would certainly have fitted the large shield-shaped box. Votes for Women reported Mrs. Pankhurst's comment that she would be proud to hand the necklace on to her children when she died. Unfortunately, she doesn't seem to have done so, and like Flora Drummond's necklace, its location is currently unknown. This portrait of Christabel Pankhurst shows her wearing both a necklace and a striking spiralling brooch. The brooch is a rare example of an identifiable suffragette jewel whose whereabouts actually are known. It is in a private collection and was shown in a loan exhibition at Wartski in 1989. The brooch is set with a cabochon emerald, amethysts and 8 small pearls, and thus dates to 1908 or later. These are the same gems that were used in her mother's presentation necklace in 1909. Geoffrey Munn and Charlotte Gear have attributed this brooch to C.R. Ashby. However, the whereabouts of her equally distinctive heart-shaped pendant necklace are not known. It was clearly important to her, as she was photographed wearing it in 2 portrait images taken at different times, and perhaps it too was a presentation piece. No image shows it clearly, but the double portrait suggests it was an enamel depicting a winged figure. This, together with the shape and style of the frame, points to the work of the artist and enameller Ernestine Mills, an example of which is on the right. Mills trained at the Slade, where she learnt to enamel directly from the master enameller Alexander Fisher. She produced a prolific amount of artwork, both for the Union and for other suffrage groups too, of which a number of examples survive. I will show a couple later. This image was taken by Christina Broome at the Women's Exhibition at the Prince's Skating Rink in Knightsbridge in 1909, where Mills was working as a tea girl on the refreshment stand. Mills is the taller of the 2 women seated on the floor. Christabel Pankhurst's pendant looks very similar to the fully documented example on the right, which is certainly by Mills. This pendant was left to the Museum of London in 1995 by the daughter of Louise Eates, who was secretary of the Kensington branch of the WSPU. Kensington's presentation of the pendant to Eates, on her release from Holloway, was recorded in Votes for Women on the 14th of May 1909. The jewel was described as specially made for the occasion by Mrs. Mills, of silver and enamel, and represents the winged figure of Hope singing outside the prison bars. The pendant is attached to a chain set with purple, white and green stones. Mills used a similar frame for the enamel pendant on the left, which appeared on the market many years ago and was sold to a private collector abroad. It is signed E.M. and prominently dated 1909. Taken together, the white lily, green foliage and purple ground, the use of pearls, the identity of the artist and the date all suggest this pendant might also have suffragette connections. As always, only documentation will prove it. However, there may be some circumstantial evidence. Elizabeth Crawford featured the Ernestine Mills enamelled lily pendant on the right on her website in 2012. This was made for Margaret Murphy, the pseudonym of a member of the Irish Women's Franchise League. It is inscribed with the dates of her imprisonment in Holloway in 1912, during which Murphy endured both hard labour and force feeding, and there is therefore no doubt of its suffrage links. More modest is this small brooch in the Museum of London, perhaps a private commission. Although unsigned, the lettering and the quality and style of the enamelling point unmistakably to Ernestine Mills. On the back is scratched Mrs. G.I.W., an intriguing clue to a previous owner. An important suffragette jewel was illustrated in the arts and crafts publication The Studio in 1913-14. This is a gold pendant set with opals and made by an artist called R.C. Price. There are 2 more examples of Price's work in the same issue of The Studio, but I have no other knowledge of the artist. The pendant is in the form of a woman with arms outstretched in an attitude reminiscent of supplication, martyrdom or justice. Under the arms are details that clearly reference the arrows from prison dress. The imagery is highly appropriate to women's suffrage, and the link is confirmed by the caption, which notes that the pendant was presented to Mrs. Pethick Lawrence by her mother and 4 sisters. This would make it a rare private presentation. One of her sisters was Dorothy Pethick, who worked for the Union for many years. She was imprisoned in Newcastle in 1909 and forcibly fed. Two other sisters, Ethel Mary Pethick and Annie Budgett, both spoilt their 1911 census forms. The background to the presentation of this jewel seems clear. Together with Mrs. Pankhurst, Mrs. Pethick Lawrence and her husband Frederick were among the original leaders of the WSPU. In 1912, the Pethick Lawrences were convicted of conspiring to smash windows and sentenced to 9 months' imprisonment. They both went on hunger strike and were forcibly fed. However, after their release, they quarrelled with the Pankhursts over the increasingly militant nature of the Union's campaign. They were expelled from the organisation that same autumn, although they continued to edit votes for women. The split with the Pankhursts was painful and damaging and was widely reported. This, then, is the likely context for her family's presentation of the pendant, with its compelling imagery. It would be lovely to know where this pendant is now. I've mentioned several missing suffragette jewels which I hope will turn up one day. Unfortunately, there is another side to this story. A depressing number of items are being offered for sale as suffragette jewellery, with no evidence to support such a description. To be clear, there are some basic criteria to be met before identifying a piece as a genuine suffragette jewel. One is the date. Many pieces being sold as suffragette were made long before Mrs. Pethick Lawrence came up with a colour scheme. The country of manufacture is equally relevant. And then there are the colours. Purple is purple, not pink. Most importantly, supporting documentation is crucial, whether that's a proven association with a known suffragette or an appearance in a contemporary advertisement. A modest item like this small silver brooch in the National Museum, Scotland, could have been a suffragette jewel. The colours are right. It is set with a moonstone, amethysts and green-dyed chalcedony. Although it has no identifying marks, it is likely to be British, and it was probably made around 1910. But so far there is no documentary evidence, such as a trade catalogue or a newspaper advertisement, to support its identification as a suffragette brooch. If it ever belonged to a suffragette, that link is now lost. Intriguingly, an identical example, set with stones in the same combination of colours, appeared on eBay in 2005. It would be interesting to know if anyone finds more examples of this brooch, either set with stones in the same colours, or perhaps equally significantly different ones. But for the moment, both examples must remain only possible suffragette brooches. It is misleading to describe anything as a suffragette jewel without compelling supporting evidence. To do so not only risks misleading the purchaser, it also dishonours the suffragettes. The amethyst, pearl, green garnet and enamel necklace on the left was auctioned in Scotland in April 2006 with an estimate of £400 to £600. The auctioneer's description was confined to a statement of its materials. It sold for a hammer price of £920, which caused audible surprise in the auction room. By October, it was being offered at a well-known art and antique dealers' fair as a suffragette jewel, though with no documentation to support this description. It featured in an article in the Times Money section, specifically highlighting a selection of suffragette jewellery available at this fair, in which its new price was quoted as £4,750. It was asserted in the article that suffragette jewellery first appeared in the 1890s, that it was mainly made with green, white and violet stones, signifying give women votes, that women began wearing it when the suffragette movement was banned, and that cheaper pink tourmalines were sometimes used instead of violet amethysts. None of these assertions is correct. Even supporting documentation may not be quite what it seems. The collector who bought this piece has encouraged me to tell this tale as a warning to others. This group of items seem to have everything: an attractive if modest jewel, a jewellery box of some age, and an old typewritten label that seemed to tie everything together. But the jewel is not right. The pastes are pink, not purple. The white is not white, but transparent. Research on the Hereford jeweller named on the box showed its Hightown shop was opened by 1922, but that the Bridge Street branch must have come later, in any case not pre-1914. The typed card looked convincing though. Enid Goulden Bach is not a well-known name. She was in fact a niece of Emmeline Pankhurst and the first chair of the Suffragette Fellowship. The description of her role dates the card itself to after 1926, when the fellowship was founded as the Suffragette Club. Significantly, the card refers only to a gift. It could have been attached to almost anything. The collector subsequently told me a friend had bought another item from the same source, to which was attached a photocopy of the same card. The whole group seems to be a marriage of three orphans: jewel, box and card. Other suffrage groups besides the WSPU produced their own jewellery, badges and medals. The Women's Freedom League, for example, was another militant group that had broken away from the WSPU in the autumn of 1907. The WFL used its official colours of green, white and gold for its badges and brooches. Examples like these were advertised in the League's newspaper, The Vote, from 1909. They cost from as little as a penny, and members were actively encouraged to wear them. In an issue of The Vote dated Saturday the 6th of August 1910, under the heading Holiday Propaganda, the writer appeals, quote, "to every member who is away from home not only to wear the WFL badge, but to recognise in every other wearer a friend and co-worker. Let the badge be a sufficient introduction, for it is a sign of the new Freemasonry of women's rights." This is an enamel brooch in the League's colours made by Ernestine Mills, which is now in the Museum of London. Mills has used gold foil with the translucent enamel, a technique typical of the work of a number of arts and crafts enamellers of the period, including Phoebe Triquare and Alexander Fisher himself. Like the small brooch Mills made in the WSPU colours, this may have been a private commission for a member. The Women's Freedom League used brooches to mark their members' prison sentences long before the WSPU introduced the idea for their own members in April 1909. The earliest mention I have found so far is in a brief report in the Yorkshire Evening Post, Friday 6th of March 1908. Under the heading Holloway Prison Brooches, the report reads, 10 of the suffragettes recently released from prison have each been presented with a badge of honour in the form of a metal brooch bearing a reproduction of the main entrance of Holloway Jail. The Women's Freedom League Holloway brooches therefore predated the WSPU's version by more than a year. Their brooches were mentioned again the following year in the Sheffield Daily Telegraph for Saturday the 22nd of May 1909. The paper carried a report on a visit to Sheffield by the Prime Minister Asquith, at which local members of the WFL had planned to stage a protest. The reporter noted that, after tea, the ladies boarded 3 taxicabs and motored round the city. They wore their badges, rosettes and prison brooches, but the procession was robbed of much of its effect by the absence of the banner, which had gone missing. This silver brooch, with its depiction of the gates of Holloway Prison, was awarded to Margaret Souter Clayton. She was one of 75 suffragettes arrested on the 20th of March 1907 for disorderly conduct outside the House of Commons. The dates of her imprisonment, March the 20th to April the 3rd, 1907, are engraved on the back of the brooch. As the Women's Freedom League was not actually named until November 1907, it was obviously awarded retrospectively. Margaret Clayton was described in court as an authoress, aged 40, of Prospect House, Hollymount, Hampstead. She was sentenced to a fine of 20 shillings or 14 days' imprisonment, and naturally chose the latter. Her husband was an equally ardent suffragist, Joseph Clayton, editor of the radical literary magazine New Age. He himself was arrested at a WFL protest in 1909. Other suffrage groups adopted their own colour schemes, although they're less well known than those of the WSPU and the WFL. The Actresses' Franchise League, for example, whose members included Lily Langtry, Ellen Terry and Sybil Thorndike, used pink, white and green. The National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies was formed from a number of different groups in 1897 under the leadership of Millicent Fawcett. It used red and white until 1909 when they added green. Their badges were produced in a wide variety of different forms by several makers, including W. O. Lewis of Birmingham. The organisation's Great Smith Street address on the back of the top badge dates it to between 1911 and 1917. These are badges issued by two of the religious groups campaigning for women's suffrage. The two on the upper row were produced for the Church League for Women's Suffrage, founded in 1909 by the Reverend Claude Hinscliffe and his wife Gertrude Stevenson. Hinscliffe co-officiated at the funeral of Emily Wilding Davison in Bloomsbury in 1913, alongside his fellow Church League member, the Reverend Charles Baumgarten. According to Elizabeth Crawford, by the end of 1913 the League had 103 branches and more than 5,000 members, and they offered 5 different designs of badges made in 2 sizes. The badge on the lower row was produced for the Jewish League for Women's Suffrage. It was founded in 1912 to campaign for both political and religious rights for women, and its membership included men as well as women. The Hebrew words in white within the purple outer border come from Proverbs and mean, "It is the joy of the righteous to do justice." The membership of the League was small, only some 300 in 1913, so this is a rare badge. This example was sold at auction in the United States in 2021, and there is another in the collections of the LSE. Even the anti-suffragists had their own colour schemes and jewellery. The National League for Opposing Women's Suffrage was formed in 1910. By 1914, it had 42,000 paying members and 15,000 other adherents. About 5 out of 6 of its members were women. The League issued badges and medallions in its colour scheme of white, pink and black. The piece at the top is a celluloid badge. The piece at the bottom left is a medallion intended to be worn suspended from a ribbon in the colours. It was originally attached to the clothing by a safety pin brooch like the one on the bottom right. I want to end with a member of the Women's Social and Political Union. This is Rose Yanel Lamartine Yates, Treasurer and Organising Secretary of the Wimbledon Branch Committee of the WSPU. The daughter of French parents, she had studied modern languages and philology at Royal Holloway College, but as a woman she was not allowed to graduate. Yates was a hard-working activist for the suffrage cause, who went on to be elected to the Greater London Council as an independent in 1919. This portrait was taken after her election. She is shown here several years earlier, alongside her son Paul, who was born in 1908, 2 days before Women's Sunday. Her husband Thomas, also pictured with Paul, was a Chancery Lane solicitor 26 years older than his wife. He was a dedicated supporter of women's suffrage and frequently offered legal advice to WSPU members. When his wife was arrested in 1909 for taking part in a deputation to Asquith, he defended her in court. Rose was jailed for a month, despite the fact that her son was only a few months old. You might be able to make out the Holloway brooch on her tie just above the sash. The couple produced this remarkable census form in 1911. The same year, Tom himself was arrested during a suffrage protest. Their large house became a refuge for suffragettes recovering from imprisonment and hunger strikes, and their gardens were apparently planted in the colours of the WSPU. Over the years, Thomas gave his wife a series of birthday presents which underlined his support for her work with a local WSPU branch. In 1910, it was a large collection of chairs for the branch meeting room. In 1911, it was a clock for the Wimbledon WSPU shop. In January 1909, a few weeks before her arrest and imprisonment, he gave her a letter that included this remarkable line: "The present I give thee is not gold or silver, but permission freely and gladly to offer up thy liberty for the benefit of downtrodden women. Sometimes, it seems, some things are simply more valuable than jewellery."